Nobody in Larkspur Flat meant to be cruel. That was the strange, sad truth of it. On the morning in question, a hard blue morning in October of 1878, with the cottonwoods along the creek gone the color of old coin, the men and women walking past the mercantile steps all had reasons of their own for not stopping. The freight wagon was 3 days late. The church roof fund was short. Somebody's boy had the croup. Everybody in Larkspur Flat was carrying something, and most of them had long since stopped noticing what other people were carrying, because there wasn't room left to notice. So when an 8-year-old girl named Bess Talmadge sat down on those steps with her knees pulled to her chest and started to cry, not loud, not the kind of crying that asks anything of anyone, just the low, worn crying of somebody who has been crying off and on for the better part of 3 weeks, the town did what tired, frightened towns do. It looked away. It walked a little faster. One woman in a gray shawl crossed clean to the far boardwalk so she wouldn't have to pass close enough to feel obliged. Bess didn't blame them. She had stopped expecting different. Voss Cobb, the boy who swept out Voss's mercantile each morning, paused with his broom and looked at her the way a person looks at a stray dog they'd already fed once. Half pity, half the practical fear that feeding it again meant it would never leave. Then he went back to sweeping. If you have ever watched a child cry in public and felt your own feet keep walking anyway, you already understand this story better than you think you do. Stay with it. It gets to where it's going. Bess wasn't crying about her mother today, or not only about her mother. She was crying because her little brother Micah, 3 years old and the only family she had left breathing, had a fever come on him in the night that felt too much like the one that had taken their mother 3 weeks back, and Mrs. Odell, who rented them the room above the mercantile out of a kindness that was running thin, had gone to the Tuesday market and wouldn't be back till noon. And Mr. Voss had told her plain that morning that the room needed to be cleared by the end of the week regardless, on account of 4 months owed and no one left to owe it. Bess had gone to Doc Ferry's office with the last of the coins from the tin cup where her mother used to keep egg money, and the doctor's wife had looked at those 3 coins in the girl's palm and said, not unkindly, that it wasn't near enough, and to come back when it was. So Bess sat on the steps because her legs had simply stopped carrying her anywhere else, and she cried, and Larkspur Flat walked past. 8 months before that morning, Emmett Talmadge had gone into the Silver Doe claim with 4 other men and come out only in the box the mine company provided, free of charge, which was the one thing the mine company had ever given the family for nothing. 3 weeks before that October morning, Fay Talmadge had finally lost the fight her lungs had been losing since the funeral. Grief settles in the chest of the living, sometimes the same way it settles in the chest of the dying, and nobody in town could say for certain which had killed her faster, the cold winter or the cold widowing. There had been a funeral. There had been 1 casserole delivered by the minister's wife, who stayed 11 minutes. There had been a great deal of talk in the mercantile and the barber shop about what ought to be done for those poor Talmadge children, followed by a great deal of nothing being done, which is how talk usually resolves itself in small towns with large opinions and short memories. Bess had buried her mother's rosewater bottle with her, because her mother had loved the smell of it, and Bess did not think a person should go into the ground smelling like nothing at all. Then she had come home and made supper for Micah, because that was what her mother would have done, and some griefs are so large that moving your hands is the only thing that keeps them from swallowing you whole. She was 8 years old. She had not cried in front of another living soul until this morning. Judson Crane had not planned to be riding through Larkspur Flat at all. He'd delivered 40 head to a buyer 2 valleys east and was cutting southwest toward Winter Range, leading a spare horse and wanting nothing from the world but a dry bed and a town small enough not to ask him questions. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd worked outdoors since he was a boy, with a scar through one eyebrow from a fence wire that had nearly cost him the eye, and gray eyes that had gone a little flat and careful over the last 2 winters, the way a man's eyes do when he has learned that stopping to feel things costs more than he can always afford to pay. He had not gotten down off a horse for a crying child in 2 years, not since Sadie. He saw Bess from 40 feet off, a small shape folded in on itself on a mercantile step, the whole street moving around her like water around a stone. And something in him that had gone quiet a long while back lifted its head. He told himself to ride on. Larkspur Flat wasn't his trouble. He had his own weight to carry. And he'd learned the hard way that a man could not always lift somebody else's without dropping his own. He got down off the horse anyway. He crossed the street slow, the way he'd learned to move around anything easily spooked, and crouched down in front of her so they were closer to eye level, his hat tipped back, his coat still white with trail dust at the collar. "What's got you sitting out here in the cold, miss?" Bess wiped her face with the back of her wrist and looked at him with the particular flatness of a child who has learned that strangers asking questions rarely mean to follow through on the asking. "Nothing. Mister, go on. I asked because I'd like to know, not because I mean to make you answer." "We're not charity," Bess said. It came out fast, the way a thing does when it's been said before and rehearsed since. "My brother's just poorly, and I'm figuring it out." "I believe you're figuring it out," Judson said. "I can see that plain. I'm asking how bad poorly is." Bess looked at him a long moment. She had her mother's eye for people, one of the few things grief hadn't taken from her. And something about the stillness in him, the way he waited without pushing, made her decide, against every instinct that had kept her upright these 3 weeks, to answer honestly. "He's hot as a stove lid and he won't hardly wake up," she said, and her voice cracked clean through the middle of it. "And the doctor won't come without money, and I don't have the money, and Mrs. Odell's at market, and I don't—" She stopped. She would not cry again in front of a stranger. "I don't know what to do." Judson Crane was quiet for 3 heartbeats, 4. Then he stood and held out his hand, not to be taken, just offered. "Show me where he's at." Doc Aldous Ferry took one look at the coins Judson set on his desk, a good deal more than Bess had offered that morning, and got his bag without another word about payment. He found Micah fevered and dry-mouthed but breathing clear, and pronounced it a hard chest cold rather than the consumption that had taken the mother. Treatable, he said, with rest and broth and willow bark tea, provided somebody kept after it faithful for the better part of a week. Somebody, in this case, turned out to be Judson Crane, who had planned to be 40 miles southwest by sundown, and instead spent that night on the floor of a rented room above a mercantile, feeding a stranger's little brother spoonfuls of broth every hour until the fever broke somewhere near 4 in the morning. Bess watched him do it and did not know what to make of him. She had decided, somewhere in the last 8 months, that grown men who offered help generally wanted something back, or grew tired of giving it, or both. She waited for either. Neither came. What came instead over the following days was smaller and stranger. Judson paid Mrs. Odell a week's rent and did not mention it again. He brought flour and salt pork from the mercantile and let Bess do the cooking herself when she insisted on it, because he'd noticed she needed the doing of things more than she needed the having of them done. He mended the busted hinge on the shutter without being asked. He did not touch Micah's hair the way strangers sometimes did. Like the boy was a curiosity, and he did not tell Bess she was brave, which she had come to find was something people said when they didn't know what else to say and wanted credit for saying something. On the 3rd evening, over a supper of beans and cornbread, Bess asked him the question she'd been turning over since he crouched down on that step. "Why'd you stop? Everybody else just walked on by." Judson was quiet a moment, working the words the way a man works a fence post that's set stubborn in dry ground. "My wife's name was Naomi," he said. "We had a girl, Sadie. She'd have been about your age now." He looked at his coffee rather than at Bess. "Scarlet fever took them both, 2 winters back. While I was 3 weeks out on a cattle drive I didn't need to take. I've been telling myself since that there wasn't anything I could have done different. Some days I believe it." He looked up. "I saw you sitting on those steps, and I thought about how nobody stopped for Naomi and Sadie either. Not soon enough. And I decided I was done being one more person who kept riding." Bess sat with that. She thought about her mother's rosewater bottle in the ground. She thought about some griefs are so large the only way through is to keep moving. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your girl." "I'm sorry about your folks," Judson said. "Seems we both got reason to be tired." Neither of them said anything else for a while. Nothing else needed saying. The trouble, when it came, did not come from a villain. It came from Garrison Voss, who ran the mercantile and had carried the Talmadge's unpaid account on his books for 4 months out of a mixture of decency and dread, and who had finally done what frightened, practical men do when a debt sits too long unpaid. He mentioned the situation in passing to the county overseer when that man came through on his regular circuit. Emery Slade arrived on a Thursday with a satchel of papers and the settled patience of a man who had delivered bad news often enough to no longer flinch at it. Bridger County law, he explained to Judson and Mrs. Odell both, was plain on the matter. Minor children without a legal guardian of record, upon coming to the county's attention, were to be conveyed to the Bridger County home by week's end, regardless of any private arrangements made in the meantime. He said he was sorry for it. He seemed in his tired way to mean it. "They'll likely be split," Slade added, not unkindly, checking his ledger. "Boy's age goes to the younger dormitory. Girl's age goes to the older. It isn't cruelty, ma'am. It's simply how the house is built." Bess, listening from the stairwell, went very still. She had lost her father to a mountain and her mother to a fever, and she had held herself together through both by the fierce, private conviction that whatever else the world took, it would not take Micah from arm's reach. Now a man with a satchel was telling her, gently, that it would. She did not cry. She had used up her crying on that step 3 weeks and 1 lifetime ago. She went and found Judson in the yard and asked him straight, the way her mother had taught her to ask hard things. "Are you going to let them do that?" Judson looked at her a long moment, and something in his face was working through a decision the size of which she couldn't yet measure. "No," he said, "I am not." He rode for the church that same hour, where Judge Wharton Ames, a circuit judge who came through Larkspur Flat twice a year to settle land disputes nobody else wanted to touch, happened to be finishing court on an unrelated matter. Judson petitioned right there before the judge could pack his papers to be named legal guardian of Bess and Micah Talmadge on the spot before Slade's Friday deadline came and went. It was not, by the letter of things, a simple ask. Judson had no property in the county, no standing testimony, nothing but a drover's wages and a small unproved ranch 2 days' ride west. Slade objected on procedure. Voss, called forward to speak to the family's character, shifted in his seat and admitted, quietly, and with the particular discomfort of a man watching his own smaller motives laid out in daylight, that he'd mentioned the matter to the overseer, mostly hoping the county would settle the unpaid account, not out of any judgment against the children themselves. It wasn't villainy. It was only the ordinary, forgivable cowardice of a man who hadn't wanted to be the one left holding a debt nobody could pay. The room understood that, and something in the room's understanding of Voss shifted quietly, the way opinion does when a small truth gets said out loud instead of left to whisper. Doc Ferry spoke next of his own accord, describing the week he'd watched a stranger sit up nights over a sick child that wasn't his, Mrs. Odell spoke after him of the rent paid without complaint and the hinge mended without asking. Judge Ames looked at Judson for a long moment. "You understand this is not a small undertaking." "Mr. Crane, 2 children, permanently, God willing." "I understand it," Judson said. "And you're prepared to answer for it, not for a week, not for a season, but for as long as it takes." Judson thought of Naomi. He thought of Sadie and the 3 weeks he'd been gone when it mattered most. "Judge," he said, "I've already learned what it costs a man to not stay. I don't aim to make that mistake twice." The judge signed the guardianship as provisional that afternoon, pending a county review in the spring, which was, Judson would later say, about the fastest thing he'd ever seen a circuit judge do. Micah, who had slept through most of the proceeding in Mrs. Odell's lap, woke near the end of it, looked around the strange room full of strange grown-up faces, found Judson's, and, for the first time since his mother's funeral, laughed. It was a small, ordinary 3-year-old sound, delighted by nothing in particular. It cut through that solemn room like sun through a shut door. Bess crossed the floor and put her arms around Judson Crane's middle and did not let go for a long time. Nobody in the room said anything. Nothing else needed saying. Spring came to Judson's small ranch northwest of Larkspur Flat the way it comes to that country. Reluctant, then all at once. The winter rye came up green along the fence line Bess had helped mend herself. insisting on doing her share of the work the way her mother had raised her to. Micah had put on the weight the fever had cost him, and then some, and had taken to following the ranch dog everywhere with the single-minded devotion small boys reserve for animals who will not tell them no. In April, Judson took the children out to the small fenced plot behind the house where Naomi and Sadie were, buried under a young cottonwood he'd planted the spring after they died and never once visited since. He stood there a while before he spoke. "I used to come out here alone," he said. "Couldn't bring myself to since. Thought it'd hurt too much to look at." He glanced down at Bess. "But I wanted you both to know they were here. Naomi would have liked you something fierce. And Sadie," his voice caught, briefly, and held. "Sadie would have liked having somebody her own size to run around with." Bess reached over without being told to and put her hand in his. "We can visit them," she said, "if you want company." He did. That was, in its way, the healing of it. Not the forgetting, but the sharing. A man does not set down a grief by pretending it was never heavy. He sets it down by letting somebody else help carry the shape of it. By summer, the town of Larkspur Flat had come around the way towns do, slowly and without much ceremony. Garrison Voss, who had spent a spring turning something over in his own conscience, offered Bess honest paid work, mending linens when she came to town, and paid her fare, and never once called it charity. At the church social in June, Bess sat on the front step of the schoolhouse porch in the evening light, watching Micah chase fireflies with the dog at his heels. And for a moment the picture of it, a girl on a step, knees drawn up, watching the world, was near enough to that October morning to make her chest go tight. But this time she wasn't crying, and this time nobody walked past. Judson came and sat down beside her, the way he had crouched down in front of her all those months back, and neither of them said much of anything, because by then they didn't need to. Some towns fail people first and find their better selves after. Some men ride on past what breaks their hearts to look at, because looking costs too much, and some once in a great while get down off the horse anyway. If you've ever wondered what you'd do, standing in that street, whether you'd be the one who crossed to the far boardwalk, or the one who stopped, that's a question worth carrying home with you tonight.